Welcome back to our channel. Today we'll explore the story of a young woman born into the most illustrious and powerful dynasty in Europe, the House of Habsburg. She was blessed with staggering beauty, a noble lineage, and a future that seemed preordained for greatness. She was on the verge of becoming a queen, the living symbol of a peace treaty between two great nations. But she would never wear her crown. Her destiny and her life would be consumed not by war or political intrigue, but by a moment of youthful panic, a forbidden pleasure, and a dress made of dreams and fire. This is the haunting story of Archduchess Mathilda of Austria, a princess whose life became a chilling cautionary tale, a gothic tragedy of how a single secret cigarette could set an imperial world ablaze. To truly grasp the tragedy of Mathilda's story, we must first step into the world she inhabited. The Austrian Empire of the 1860s was a magnificent contradiction, an ancient glittering giant that was beginning to feel the cold tremors of its own mortality. For 600 years, the House of Habsburg had been the central pillar of European power, a sprawling multi-ethnic empire of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, and Italians, all bound together by their allegiance to the emperor in Vienna. But the winds of change were howling at the gates of the Hofburg Palace. The potent new forces of nationalism and liberalism, which had upended France, were now threatening to tear the Habsburgs' patchwork empire apart at the seams. The decade leading up to Mathilda's short-lived womanhood had been one of profound humiliation for Austria. In 1859, the empire was outmaneuvered by the brilliant statecraft of Italian nationalists and their French allies, losing the rich province of Lombardy in a bloody war. Then came the ultimate catastrophe, 1866. In a war lasting a mere 7 weeks, the disciplined and modern armies of Prussia, a rival German state, delivered a series of crushing defeats to Austria, culminating in the Battle of Königgrätz. This wasn't just a military loss, it was a seismic shift in the European order. Austria was expelled from German affairs, its centuries-long leadership of the German-speaking world shattered forever. In that same conflict, its erstwhile Italian rivals seized the opportunity to annex the province of Venetia. In less than a decade, the empire had been battered, beaten, and diminished, its prestige in tatters. This string of disasters created a palpable sense of crisis in Vienna. The Emperor Franz Joseph I was a man who personified the empire's spirit, deeply conservative, relentlessly dutiful, and wedded to the traditions of the past. Faced with near collapse, he was forced to make a revolutionary concession. In 1867, the very year of Mathilda's death, he agreed to the Great Ausgleich, or compromise, which split the empire in two. It became the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, giving the proud and restless Hungarians near equal status. It was a radical solution to save a dying state, a sign of just how precarious the Habsburg situation had become. This was the backdrop of Mathilda's life, an empire steeped in glorious tradition, but gripped by a deep-seated anxiety about the future. The court she grew up in reflected this tension. On the surface, it was the most formal and rigid in all of Europe. Life was governed by the so-called Spanish court ceremonial, a labyrinthine code of etiquette, centuries old, that dictated every single interaction, from how one ate their soup to who could walk through which palace door. It was a world of profound formality, designed to elevate the imperial family to a semi-divine status, separating them from mere mortals. The Empress herself, the famously beautiful and free-spirited Elizabeth, known as Sisi, found these rules so suffocating that she spent much of her life in open rebellion against them, escaping the Viennese court whenever she could. For the young archduchesses of the house, like Mathilda, This environment was all they ever knew. Their lives were a performance, played out on a grand public stage from the moment they were born. Their purpose was singular: to serve the dynasty. This meant being educated to perfection, displaying flawless decorum, and, above all, preparing for a marriage that would serve the state. They were the most precious diplomatic currency the empire possessed. A well-placed archduchess could mend a broken alliance, neutralize an enemy, or secure a new friendship. Her personal happiness was, at best, a secondary consideration. Duty to the House of Habsburg came first, last, and always. It was into this gilded cage in a time of imperial crisis that Matilda was born, destined for a role she would never get to play. Matilda Marie Adelgunde Alexandra came into the world on January 25, 1849, a product of one of the most powerful unions within the Habsburg dynasty. She was a member of the Teschen branch of the family, a line known for its immense wealth and military prowess. Her father was Archduke Albrecht, a figure who could have stepped straight out of an earlier, more heroic age. Albrecht was the nephew of the emperor who had defeated Napoleon, and he was, without question, the most formidable military commander in the Austrian Empire. In the disastrous War of 1866, his army was the only one to win a major victory, defeating the Italians at the Battle of Custoza. He was a national hero, a symbol of Austrian strength and tradition in an age of defeat. But as a man and as a father, he was the embodiment of old-world autocracy. He was fiercely conservative, deeply religious, and believed in discipline, order, and unquestioning obedience above all else. Photographs show a man with a stern, unyielding gaze, a thick mustache, and the rigid posture of a lifelong soldier. In his home, his word was law, and his standards of behavior, especially for his daughters, were impossibly high. In stark contrast, Matilda's mother was Princess Hildegard of Bavaria, a daughter of the Wittelsbach dynasty, the same family as the Empress Sisi. Hildegard was known for her kindness, piety, and gentle nature. She brought a warmth to the household that tempered her husband's severe nature. Matilda was their second daughter, named, as was the custom, for her maternal aunts. She had an older sister, Maria Theresia, and the family had suffered the loss of a son, Karl, in infancy, a private grief that was all too common in the 19th century. Growing up in the Palais Erzherzog Albrecht in Vienna, later known as the Albertina Museum, Matilda's childhood was one of immense privilege, but also strict routine. The education of an archduchess was rigorous. She would have been fluent in German, French, Italian, and Hungarian with a working knowledge of Czech and Polish. She would have studied history, literature, and geography, all carefully curated to reinforce the Habsburg worldview. A significant portion of her day would have been dedicated to the arts, music, and, in Matilda's case, drawing, for which she showed a genuine and noted talent. But the most important part of her education was in comportment: how to walk, how to talk, how to dance, how to greet everyone from a visiting monarch to a stable hand with the precise degree of formality required. She was being polished into the perfect dynastic jewel. Contemporaries described her as a stunningly beautiful young woman, possessing the characteristic Habsburg jaw, but softened by a grace and charm that made her immensely popular at court. She was seen as a bright, lively presence in the otherwise stilted atmosphere of Vienna. But this poised exterior concealed a growing spirit of independence, one that would inevitably clash with the iron will of her father. A devastating blow struck the family when Matilda was just 15 years old. In March 1864, her mother, Princess Hildegard, traveled to her native Munich for the funeral of her brother, King Maximilian II of Bavaria. While there, she contracted a severe lung infection. Her health declined rapidly, and she died just a few weeks later. The loss was catastrophic for the teenage Matilda. She was deprived of her mother's gentle influence and affection, just as she was entering womanhood. From that point on, she and her sister were left solely to the care of their formidable father. The palace, already a place of strict rules, would have become even more austere, the paternal eye watching every move. This loss undoubtedly deepened Matilda's sense of isolation and may have fueled her desire for small private freedoms in a life that was becoming ever more constricted. As she entered her 18th year, the machinery of state began to turn. The empire needed allies, and the most pressing diplomatic project was the reconciliation with the new kingdom of Italy. The wounds of the recent wars were still fresh, but a dynastic marriage could, it was hoped, begin a process of healing. The groom was to be Umberto of Savoy, the 22-year-old crown prince of Italy. As the heir to the throne, his marriage was a matter of immense political importance, and Matilda, a beautiful Catholic princess from the most prestigious house in Europe, was the perfect choice. The match was strategically brilliant, a union between the son of the Italian king and the daughter of Austria's greatest general. The very man who had defeated the Italians at Custoza would have been a breathtakingly powerful symbol of the end of hostilities. It was a chance to turn the page on decades of bloodshed. For Matilda, this was her assigned destiny. She was to be sacrificed, as all royal women were, on the altar of diplomacy. She would be sent to a foreign court to marry a man she had likely never met, to become the queen of a people who had, until very recently, been her country's bitter enemies. Her personal feelings were irrelevant. The future of Austro-Italian relations was at stake. As 1867 began, preparations were underway. Her life was about to begin its true purpose. She stood on the threshold of a great and important future, unaware that she had only a few months left to live. The evening of June 6, 1867, found the imperial family at Hetzendorf Palace, a lovely summer residence just outside Vienna, away from the stifling formality of the Hofburg. Matilda, at the peak of her youth and beauty, was preparing for an evening at the theater. This was a routine part of court life, an occasion for seeing and being seen, another performance in a life filled with them. She was dressed in the height of fashion, a magnificent ballgown designed to dazzle. Let us pause and consider the fashion of that era, for it is central to this tragedy. The immense, rigid crinoline hoop skirts of the 1850s were beginning to give way to a softer, more fluid silhouette, with volume concentrated at the back of the skirt. Fabrics were light, airy, and layered to create a sense of ethereal beauty. Tulle, a fine silk netting, was a favorite for evening wear. It floated and moved with a dreamlike quality. To give the fabric more body, to make it seem fuller and more cloud-like, dressmakers had a secret weapon. They would treat the tulle with a fine mist of glycerin. It gave the material a subtle sheen and a beautiful drape. It also, however, had an unfortunate side effect that was either unknown or criminally ignored by the fashion houses of Paris and Vienna. Glycerin is dangerously flammable. Matilda's exquisite gown, a masterpiece of couture, was in effect a delicate, wearable bomb. Dressed for the theater, waiting for her family to gather, Matilda found herself with a few quiet moments. It was in these moments that she chose to engage in her small, secret rebellion. She slipped away to indulge in a cigarette. This act cannot be overstated in its social significance. For a woman of her rank and time, smoking was utterly scandalous. It was associated with actresses, bohemians, and women of loose morals. For an archduchess, a paragon of imperial virtue, it was unthinkable. and for the daughter of the arch-conservative Archduke Albrecht, it was a forbidden act of the highest order. And then disaster struck. She heard the unmistakable sound of her father's footsteps, his firm military tread approaching her room. A surge of pure panic, the kind any teenager who is about to be caught breaking the rules would recognize, shot through her. Her mind would have raced. To be discovered would be a humiliation. It would lead to a furious tirade from her father, a lecture on duty, decorum, and her failure to live up to the Habsburg name. Her immediate, unthinking instinct was to conceal the evidence. Without a second to consider the consequences, she spun around, thrusting the lit cigarette behind her back. She tried to hide it within the voluminous, airy folds of her glycerin-treated tulle skirt. It was the single most catastrophic decision of her life. The glowing ember of the cigarette, no bigger than a ladybug, made contact with the chemically treated fabric. There was no slow smolder, no wisp of smoke to give warning. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Her dress erupted into a sheet of flame. One moment she was a beautiful princess in a magnificent gown. The next, she was a human torch. The scream that ripped through the genteel quiet of the palace was one of primal terror and agony. It brought servants, ladies-in-waiting, and her family running. Archduke Albrecht, the very man whose approach had triggered the disaster, was among the first to arrive. He was met with a vision from hell, his own daughter, his 18-year-old child, engulfed in a pillar of fire, her beautiful gown now a raging inferno. The scene descended into chaos and horror. Courtiers and family members stood frozen for a moment in disbelief before their training and sense of duty gave way to panicked, desperate action. They grabbed at heavy draperies, rugs, anything they could find to smother the flames that were consuming her. But the fire was ferocious, fed by the light fabric and the chemical accelerant. It was a battle they could not win. By the time they finally managed to extinguish the blaze, the damage was irreparable. Mathilda was still alive, but she had suffered burns so severe and extensive that they were beyond any hope of treatment. The medical knowledge of the 1860s was completely helpless in the face of such trauma. She was in unimaginable, excruciating pain, yet she remained conscious, surrounded by the weeping, horrified faces of her family. Her father, the great general who had faced down enemy cannons without flinching, was forced to stand by, utterly powerless, and watch his daughter die in the most agonizing way imaginable. The tragic irony would not have been lost on him. His own presence, his own fearsome authority, had directly precipitated his daughter's fatal, panicked mistake. She lingered for a short time, her cries echoing through the palace, before death finally released her from her suffering. She died that same day, June 6, 1867. The bright future of a prospective Queen of Italy had been reduced to ash and agonizing memory. In the immediate aftermath, a pall of horrified grief descended upon the Habsburg court. The death of a young royal was always a somber affair, but the circumstances of Mathilda's passing were so uniquely grotesque that they sent a shockwave of trauma through the family and the aristocracy of Europe. This was not a pious death from a wasting illness or a noble sacrifice in childbirth. It was a brutal, senseless, and deeply undignified end that defied the ordered ceremonial world of the Habsburgs. For Archduke Albrecht, the event was a breaking point. This man of iron control and discipline was shattered by a grief compounded by a terrible unspoken guilt. He had not only lost his daughter, but his own rigid principles had been the catalyst for the tragedy. He became a more withdrawn, even more severe figure in the years that followed, but his private sorrow found a public outlet. He commissioned a grand, ornate fountain to be built in a Vienna marketplace, naming it the Mathildenbrunnen. It was a tribute in stone and water to the daughter he had lost, a permanent memorial to a grief that would never leave him. The political ramifications were swift and decisive. The proposed marriage to Crown Prince Umberto of Italy was, of course, cancelled. The delicate web of diplomacy that had been woven around this union was torn apart. The grand project of Austro-Italian reconciliation through marriage was abandoned. History doesn't stand still for personal tragedy. Umberto was married the following year to his first cousin, Margherita of Savoy. She would become a vastly popular and influential queen of Italy, a fashion icon in her own right. The path of Italian history went on, but the potential influence of a Habsburg queen at its heart was extinguished forever. It remains one of history's tantalizing what-ifs. Beyond the court and the corridors of power, Matilda's death had a startlingly modern resonance. It became a public sensation, a cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms and reported in lurid detail in the newspapers of London, Paris, and New York. Her story was the ultimate illustration of a very real and often overlooked danger of the 19th century: killer fashion. For decades, women's clothing had been a fire hazard. The massive crinoline hoop skirts of the 1850s and 60s were notoriously dangerous. Made of light fabrics stretched over a rigid frame, they were incredibly difficult for the wearer to judge the distance from an open flame. Thousands of women across Europe and America died in crinoline fires. The poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's wife died in such an accident. Oscar Wilde's two half-sisters perished when one of their gowns caught fire at a Halloween ball. These were not isolated incidents. They were a public health crisis hiding in plain sight. Matilda's death was the most high-profile case imaginable. She wasn't just an anonymous victim. She was an Archduchess of Austria. Her story starkly highlighted the deadly combination of flammable fabrics, chemical treatments like glycerin, and a world still lit by candles, gas lamps, and fireplaces. It forced a conversation about the price of beauty and the recklessness of fashion. While it didn't spark an overnight revolution, her tragedy became part of a growing body of evidence that pushed for safer clothing and, eventually, a move towards less voluminous and dangerous styles. In a tragic, unforeseen way, her death may have saved the lives of other women who learned from her terrible fate. When we look back at Matilda's story, it's tempting to see it as a simple freak accident, a moment of youthful folly with a terrible price. But to do so is to miss the deeper, more poignant context. Is it possible to see her story not just as an accident, but as a tragedy born of repression? The central element, the secret cigarette, can be interpreted as more than a simple vice. In the suffocating atmosphere of the Habsburg court, where every action was prescribed and every emotion was suppressed, that small act of smoking may have been her only sphere of personal autonomy. It was a tiny rebellion against the monolithic authority of her father and the system he represented. Empress Sisi, her relative by marriage, rebelled overtly. She rejected the court, spent her time on obsessive beauty rituals, horseback riding, and poetry, creating a legend of tragic nonconformity. Matilda's rebellion was quieter, secret, and ultimately far more deadly. Her panicked attempt to hide the cigarette was not just the fear of a daughter for her father. It was the desperate instinct of someone trying to protect the last remaining piece of their private self from an all-consuming system of control. Following the ancient rites of her dynasty, Archduchess Mathilda was laid to rest in the imperial crypt in Vienna, the great subterranean necropolis of the Habsburgs. In a peculiar tradition reserved for the most important members of the family, Her heart was removed and placed in its own urn in the Herzgruft, the crypt of hearts. It rests there today, a fragile organ in a silver container, surrounded by the hearts of emperors and empresses who lived out their grand destinies. Hers is the heart of a destiny unfulfilled. Matilda's legacy is not written in treaties or monuments, save for the fountain erected by her grieving father. She left no great mark on the political landscape of Europe. She is a footnote in the grand saga of the Habsburgs. And yet her story endures with a power that transcends her historical importance. It has the haunting quality of a dark fairy tale, a gothic horror story set in a palace. She has become a symbol of the fragility of life, the perils of fashion, and the human cost of imperial grandeur. Her story is a profound human tragedy. It reminds us that history is not just a sequence of great events, but a tapestry of individual lives, each with its own hopes, fears, and fatal flaws. Matilda was a princess on the brink of a life that was not of her own choosing, a life of duty and sacrifice. She made a small, relatable, and deeply human mistake, and the consequence was absolute. Her fiery end can almost be seen as a terrible metaphor for the empire she belonged to, a magnificent, rigid, and beautiful creation, seemingly invincible, yet dangerously flammable, and ultimately doomed to be consumed by the new, modern forces it could not control. We remember Archduchess Mathilda not for the queen she might have been, but for the girl she was, a young woman trapped between tradition and a glimmer of personal freedom, a life of immense privilege that offered no escape. Her ghost haunts the edges of the Habsburg story, a whispering reminder that even in the grandest of palaces, a single hidden spark can reduce all the plans of emperors and kings to sorrow and to ash.